spending 18,000 miles a year in your car and countless hours, away from your family and just on the road listening to great podcasts and music and stuff, it has a kind of satisfaction to it that is meaningful, and it's not nothing. But I think when you are a freelancer and you have this opportunity to mix in different things in your life, getting stuck on like what other people think your career should look like can lead to a lot of unhappiness.
The last time I had today's guest on the podcast, I was still living in Chicago. I was separated from my wife. We weren't divorced. I was just living in Chicago still, trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do in San Francisco. And I feel like that conversation just took place, but it was like 600 episodes ago at this point. It's so crazy. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. And one of the people that I find most inspiring and have found the most inspiring over the years is Brent Edmondson. That's today's guest. And he has been able to have his fingers in all sorts of musical pies. That's a weird analogy, but I guess we'll go with that here. And has pivoted so remarkably in this pandemic. During this pandemic, he was subbing regularly with the Philadelphia Orchestra, was playing all kinds of other gigs, and was taking auditions and really going all in on the performance thing. After having done many things in the music world, he was a student of Renan Myers back in the day. Actually, if we go way back into the podcast archives, Renan and I were talking about Brent back in like 2007 or something like that. I have had such a great time following with what Brent has been up to over the years, both on the bass and off the bass. He and I served on the International Society of Bassists board for a bit, and Brent saw the writing on the wall when this pandemic hit, seems like to me at least, and is now composing for Netflix. What? How did that happen? Well, we get into that in this conversation. Brent does so many things. Great human being. I just can't say enough good things about him. I know you're going to enjoy this conversation. Quick shout out to our sponsors, Dorico, Ear Trumpet Labs, Practisma, and Modacity. We go deep on Dorico, by the way. Brent uses Dorico, as do I. So we'll get into that and many other things in this talk with Brent. Were you doing film scoring previous to this? How'd you get into that? How did that happen?
So about a year and change ago, I was getting ready to go on tour with the Philly Orchestra, and they had designated it so that I was just going to do rehearsals and no concerts for like 5 weeks leading up to this tour. And it was a really rare opportunity for me to have weekends free for like more than a month, in the fall, which normally, is just full of concertizing and stuff, and you're sort of tired all the time. And I started writing music because I had these Saturdays free, basically. And as a result of that, I ended up meeting this guy. He was in a group in the 80s called the Hooters, which was very popular in the Philadelphia market. Of course, Hooters, the restaurant, has, taken that name and run with it. And so it's, it's like a little funny to have to give this little explanation every time I talk about it. But I met up with him, and he was looking to basically create a team around him of conservatory trained people, because he's like a rock and jazz guitarist. And so we ended up, we were writing pop songs or, dance music or some, whatever, just writing kind of in the non-classical world for a while. And we ended up finding one of his contacts was a director who had worked on some art house movies and needed one of the acts of the movie scored because he was doing a director's cut. And so over the last 6 months, we've scored this film. I ended up I got really lucky and got a gig writing for a Netflix true crime documentary series that's going to be coming out next month. And, it's been like, I wasn't that guy. I was an arranger, and all of a sudden now people want to hear me write stuff, and it's been really a fun journey.
I had absolutely no idea this was happening. I'm so, wow, man, talk about a pivot. That's incredible. Right? Wow.
Yeah.
That's like the fastest pivot I've heard of. You're not, or maybe you are huddling in a ball, shaking back and forth like so many musicians from top, but at least for a lot of your time, it sounds like that's incredible. Had you composed a lot prior to this? Is that something you'd done like when you were younger, or?
Yeah, it was like one of the first things I did when I got into music. I had this software called Cakewalk, which was like a very early DAW, an early workstation. And I would feed in, Dvorak symphonies and like put drums to them and, just those sorts of like little fun things. And I started out majoring in composition at the University of Delaware. And at the time I met Renan Meyer, and he kind of elevated my bass aspirations above my compositional aspirations and put me on a track that led to the career that I've had. But, it was like, it always kind of got tucked back away along with like the guitars and everything. It just sort of, it got pushed to the background. And then when the pandemic hit, like the day after I got sort of taken off all of my gigs, I just started putting out phone calls to people that I had worked with. One of those groups of people, a pair of brothers named the Blair Brothers, and they wrote some scores that ended up on a Netflix film and a bunch of other stuff. And I had recorded a couple things for them in the past, and I just said, I'm not busy anymore. So is there anything we can do if you guys need anything in the next couple months? And it turned out they had this project cooking with Netflix that they wanted just some expansion of their orchestral toolkit. And so I came in and ended up writing cues that are going to be, all over the series when it comes out. And at that point, I felt confident enough, I guess, to hang a shingle about it and start putting it out there into the world that's what I'm doing right now. And we'll see what happens when freelancing comes back, whether that's still a significant part of my life or not. But it's a nice balance to include with the performing aspect,
Well, I've always thought of you as an inspiring person in terms of your career and what you've done and how you've handled all these different things, and subbing with Philly and, like playing at this high level, but then doing everything else. And it's like a new chapter in Brent's life. That's incredible. Okay. Well, I've talked before, and over the years, I've worked a little bit with a video game composer, and he's tapped me for bass info, like, trying to make things sound cool so it's not so monotonous for the bassist doing the recordings. Can you walk me through how does the writing process work? Like, are you seeing it takes me back to that whatever that Judd Apatow movie was where Jason do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes. It's not 40-Year-Old Virgin. It's the other one from that era.
He like goes to Hawaii. He's super sad because he's like a TV show composer. And
Forgetting Sarah Marshall. Yeah.
Forgetting Sarah Marshall. And she breaks out and he's like super dark. So that's sort of like the image I have in my mind of that kind of work. Like what's the process look like?
Have you ever heard of? There's this composer named Alf Clausen who's been on The Simpsons since the beginning, and whenever they need a sound alike of a Richard Strauss piece, Alf writes something that gets all the highlights, might capture the orchestration of it or whatever, but it's different enough that they're not paying the copyright fees to whoever wrote that piece. So the way a lot of this works is a director will be cutting their footage together, and they'll have a track that they're putting in place as like a rhythmic guide for them, or just a tonal guide to kind of give them the ambiance that they want to establish. And so you end up with that temp track, and your job is to, duplicate the mood of it without duplicating the track itself. So you might harvest the underlying, motor rhythm that's in it, da da bum ba dum bum bum, and you might take that and run with it and put something else on that differentiates it, but maybe you retain the key and the tempo, So a lot of it is that, but learning to color within the lines of that and figure out how to make it your own, or in my case, a lot of the times make it a little more like Arvo Pärt or Shostakovich or Prokofiev, or something that's going to give it the atmosphere, but kind of takes a little bit of what I know from sitting in the orchestra and feeds it into that cue. Some of them have picture, but no, I've never sat in front of a film with a keyboard and made noises and it turned out okay. That's I admire people who can do that. That's really a talent.
Now, are you doing? I'm assuming that you're doing the composing, but the orchestration as well, or is that a separate thing, or you're doing it all?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
On this Netflix series, it really worked out great that my wife and I were able to record most of the stems for it. So, you write something and then it's like basically I go from looking this way at my computer to turning sideways and recording this way. So it's a real straightforward process when you're just working out of a bedroom. But yeah, the idea, this was the director really wanted intimacy, so we ended up doing mostly string quartet or string quartet plus an extra violin line or something like that, and bass, cello, viola, violin, and so my wife plays violin and viola, and so we were able to do most of the stuff in house here as we were doing it, and kind of sell some ideas with live recording, and then they maybe would want a different direction, and then you start playing around sonically with it and using infinite reverbs or some kind of weird filtering and stuff. So it's combining that acoustic thing that we're all used to and we're all missing so much right now of like actually hearing an instrument play, and then that like coloring outside the lines thing where you can blend the technology in and hopefully create something that's a bit beyond what you could do on a stage even.
So you mentioned Pro Tools. Like, I'm assuming the DAW of choice or that you're using just because of the industry or whatever is Pro Tools.
Yeah, it is. It's like there's a whole language to it, and I think you probably use something like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut to do your video editing, right?
Yeah, I went down the Creative Cloud rabbit hole about a year and a half ago. I just said I'm going to learn these things, and I have a lot more gray hair than I did from trying to like learn some of these professional products from the early '90s. But I'm glad I did, because now I'm starting to speak the Premiere Pro language a little.
Yeah, totally. And with the thing that's nice about Premiere, in addition to being like one of the mainline film editing things, is visually that and Pro Tools have a lot of similarities. And for the director who's accustomed to cutting things with Premiere, it really, they can see visually the same kind of things. But what if we moved this over to the right a little bit, or what if we stacked these tracks on top of each other, so they can kind of, when we're on a Zoom session and they're seeing the Pro Tools session in action, they can kind of relate to it and get tactile with it in the same way that they usually do with their film editing. So I think it's a nice blend. Although Pro Tools is a very cumbersome and unpleasant beast to kind of work with most of the time.
Well, I've had a fun couple of months ripping on Avid. This conversation is getting quite technical, but I went down the Dorico rabbit hole, Steinberg's new product, and I was talking to Daniel Spreadbury, who was the product lead, I believe the product lead for Sibelius back in the day, and so it's been fun. And I'm such an amateur. I mean, man, I use it for nothing. I like doing bass duos for my students is about the extent of my ambitions, but it's been interesting to talk about the industry standards and what people use. So if I would hazard a guess, I'd say you're probably using Sibelius, but I don't know.
I was actually a Dorico day one adopter.
What?
I was so excited about it. There was all this narrative from when Avid fired the Sibelius team to Steinberg snatching them up and starting this new project, and they were blogging about it the whole way. Daniel Spreadbury's been like an incredible PR person for that whole project. So I was like salivating. I remember I was doing an education concert that morning at like 7:30, and I brought my laptop and like begged to get on the Wi-Fi at this high school so that I could download Dorico while the concert was happening, and then get home and like, and I actually, my first project was the Kusevitsky Concerto. I arranged my accompaniment when I performed that a couple of years ago, and I used Dorico to do the entire project. So it was like a Dorico 1, and now we're in 3.5. So it's been a fun journey with that.
This episode is brought to you by Dorico. And one of the things that struck me about Dorico when I first opened it up was this innovative user interface design. There are 5 different modes. There is setup, write, engrave, play, and print mode. And here is Senior Product Manager Daniel Spreadbury on why they set it up like this.
As they are presented to you on the screen, they're kind of there in a strip at the top left-hand corner of the screen, and they're very prominent. You can whack them with your mouse, or if you're using a Surface, you can tap them with your finger, and that basically then changes the whole UI of the program.
It is such an innovative design. It makes working for me so much cleaner in music notation software. I have become such a fan. I use this piece of software every single day. Check them out at Dorico.com. That'll take you to their page on Steinberg's website. And there's a free version, Dorico SE, that'll let you do practically everything the program does with up to 2 parts. So that's perfect if you're working with a student or making exercises or that kind of thing. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Dorico. This episode is brought to you by Ear Trumpet Labs. They make an incredible mic for upright bass called the Nadine, and 6-time Grammy-winning jazz bassist and former Contrabass Conversations guest, Christian McBride, is a big fan. Christian says, as an acoustic bassist, it's very important for me to have this instrument amplified as naturally as possible. What I love about this microphone is that it makes the instrument sound exactly how I hear it in my head. Honestly, I don't know if you can get a better review than that. The Nadine is an instrument-mounted condenser mic with an incredibly clear, natural sound and great feedback rejection. Ear Trumpet Labs is offering a free t-shirt with mic purchase from their website. Just visit www.eartrumpetlabs.com/contrabass to claim yours and learn more about Nadine. Brent and I are not doing an ad for Dorico, but although they are sponsored by podcast, so full disclosure. But I got totally fascinated and bought the full license, after using it a little bit because it like Ableton Live, which it's a very different product than that, but it seems to tap into the way my brain works. I just like the flow of that product, and I was a longtime Finale user, reluctant Finale user. I think I bought my first copy, my parents did in like 1991, and I was rocking my educational license from 2011 until about 7 months ago, and then I finally upgraded to the whatever latest Mac OS that is like, okay, you can't use that emulation mode anymore. And long story short, I love Dorico. So why, full disclosure aside, like why Dorico? Why'd you choose that?
So I was a Sibelius version 2 person. That's how far back I go. And that's probably 2000, 2001, somewhere in that neighborhood. And, I know that program backwards and forwards, and people to this day call me with Sibelius questions like all the time and just want to know how to do these things. And I love it. Sibelius is great, but the way that it outputs music and the way that the parts look and the score look when you first do it is not good. And it requires a bit of finesse to make sure that everything is readable, to make sure your page turns are good, all the little things, the niceties that hopefully when you're a performer and you're looking at music, you never notice these things have taken place. And Sibelius wasn't getting me there. There was a lot of hands-on work that needed to be done. And when I had this concerto in my sights and it was the biggest project that I was ever going to do, it was like, I know that there are going to be dozens and dozens of hours of editing each flute part and each, I actually ended up doing strings only, but every part needed a ton of work to get it readable and on a stand for somebody to read. And Dorico really just spits out something that is super close to ready. They had done the work in figuring out what do people need if they're just a church director and they need to drop a piece by a whole step to get it to their choir. They did the work on like, what do those people need to be able to do that between Thursday and Sunday and have it be done and not have to worry about it being readable. And I can't tell you how many hours it must have saved me using Dorico to make this concerto arrangement. It just was beautiful from day one. And, I learned the whole process. The biggest thing is switching between a Finale or Sibelius into Dorico. All your key commands don't work, your shortcuts, getting proficient in entering stuff takes a long time. And I got that work out of the way on a big, hump so that all the other stuff since then has been no problem. Just like I can grind out things really quickly and they all look very good right from the get-go. So I can't imagine myself going back, although I've used Sibelius as for clients, when I need to. And it's just like, I hate this now.
Well, it's so funny. Like I have no where you have 0.1% of the proficiency on Finale, that you had on Sibelius, I'm sure. But Finale is one of those things where I would use it in bursts, and then I would not use it for 6 months, and I'd come back and I couldn't remember how to do anything. And it always felt like I did this online course, or actually 2, and I did probably 120 musical examples with my Finale 2011 academic license, and it was like carving a foundation with a dinner spoon or something. And I started using Dorico, and so from my amateur perspective, I'd try something in Finale, couldn't remember how to do it, look it up, learn it, then I'd forget it and I wouldn't remember again. Dorico, I have to look things up, but they stick. It's like the way that language works, that shift, that popover mode, this makes so much sense. And since we're talking about it, again, not an ad for Dorico, but we're both using it, so I really dig it. I actually just had Garrett Hope, who's a composer and podcaster, on, and I talked to him about, so we're kind of having a similar conversation, like, why do I like this product so much from my amateur perspective, and why do you like it from your much more elevated, in terms of the profession perspective? I've been using, one last thing about Dorico, I've been using it with my students. I've been screen sharing over Zoom and inputting their music, and we go through and we enter fingerings and we play examples, and there's just, you could do it with other software, but there's something about the elegance of the way it looks. And then, so we're arranging on the fly. I go over to the export mode and I send them what we worked on. And it's just, it's an incredible product. And one last thing, I promise, I thought that it would be cool to put as much of my students' rep into Dorico as possible to interact with it. So my student was playing this one piece by Rabath, and I said, I'm going to make the layout identical to this page. I'm going to put all the notes in the right, and I got it. And then I thought, well, what if I just let Dorico do what it wants to do instead of me trying to force it? And it looks so much better. So I thought that was kind of a fun, weird testimonial for the product.
This reminds me of a little vanity project that I worked on a couple of years ago. And I realize it's a good thing I'm married. Like, nobody would ever consider me like a potential mate after I tell this story, because it just really brands me as the nerd that I am. But there's this amazing flute solo in Daphnis and Chloe that the basses accompany. We just have these sparse pizzes around this very mellifluous flute line. And one of my goals was to somehow get that flute solo onto the same page as that passage in Daphnis, but not have any of the music spill onto other pages. So you could literally just tape this thing into your part and have your guide, if you're the principal bass and you want to figure out where to place those pizzes. So I went and found the fonts from the Durand publishing company that publishes the orchestral parts to that. And I literally duplicated the whole thing as an exercise, and then figured out how to squish everything just enough to get this flute line into the part. And I showed it to the librarians at the Philadelphia Orchestra as sort of a, did you guys need any engraving work? Was there something I could work with you here on? And they were like, oh, that's cool. Why would anybody need that though? And so it's sort of languished. It's like it's my magnum opus of engraving, in my opinion. And it's like I don't get to talk about it enough, which is why I'm ramming it into this conversation. But I do think, as far as what you're talking about, I think that it's a really good exercise if anybody wants to get into laying music out on the page, just to do what you did and put something that you already have in there, see what comes out and see what you like and don't like about it, and start making decisions based on that. I do a lot of sometimes with Baroque music, you have to wade through a lot of markings and junk that people put in over the years, and you want to get back maybe to what does that Marcello sonata actually sound like, or what was it actually supposed to be? And you get into this and you're like, well, why did they make this so that half the first movement is on a second page, and then the second page has a page turn in the middle of it? This didn't need to be this way. And part of it's like classical music in any regard. You play it and you learn how people had done it before you can kind of figure out how to do it your own way. And so I think what you're talking about, you're on your way to being a professional engraver now, because now you're making opinions about, this doesn't look right on the page and there's a way to do it better,
People have been saying such great things about my course with Discover Double Bass Beginner's Classical Bass. Here is Nicholas Walker, professor of double bass at Ithaca College and past president of the International Society of Bassists. Nicholas writes, Jason draws from this vast network with his contagious enthusiasm and love of learning. Presented through the beautifully organized and easily accessible framework of Discover Double Bass, this is a terrific learning experience for any beginner, as well as a great model for any new teacher. I am blushing, Nicholas. Thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled with how this course came out. Jeff Chalmers and the whole team at Discover Double Bass are so professional. It was such a great experience, and it was the best representation of what I would love to take every single beginner through in terms of format and presentation. And I'm just so happy that it's out there. You can learn more. We've got a link in the show notes, or you can just visit discoverdouble.com/Jason Heath. Every day when I sit down to practice, I get out my phone and I boot up Modacity, which is my practicing companion. And I have a specific routine I go through. And here is Modacity founder and CEO Mark Gelfo on what he does each day with Modacity.
What I do when I load Modacity every day is, if I don't have a playlist constructed already, what I do is I go in and I think, how long do I have to practice right now? Okay, I've got 40 minutes. Cool, I'm going to do 5 minutes on meditation, get my body state right. I'm going to do scales for 5 minutes, and I'm going to visualize, and I'm going to do this piece that I'm working on. You just set it up, see the budget, and follow the budget effortlessly by delegating that to the phone.
Letting my phone do all those logging details has been so great for my practicing. I can't recommend this app highly enough. Love it, love it, love it. Learn more at modacity.co. And we have a special offer if you go to our site for lifetime access to this app. It's so cool. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, Modacity. Well, you know, sometimes, at least for me in my life, you get a product that just makes a creative process easier. And I've been doing way more just nerdy little bass exercises and stuff in Dorico because it's just so much faster. I don't have to like boot up Finale 2011. Apologies I think I've officially burned that bridge as a future sponsor by ripping on them so much, but that's fine. But you know, there was so much pain involved, and it just gets me going. And using something that I find both visually attractive and just that seems to work with my brain, I find so helpful. I mean, Ableton Live is a similar product for me. I end up being much more creative when I'm using that piece of software just because of the way that it's built in. And it's funny, we were talking about Premiere earlier. Premiere is something that I am now starting to understand, but oh my goodness, I sit down and I think this is a product from the early 90s. And it has, and legacy software and just the inevitable bloat, that could be a whole different conversation. But what a cool opportunity it must have been for Daniel and the team to have somebody come along and say, here are resources, build your ideal version of music notation software. And it's a complicated thing. There's no way to make it as seamless as, like, you know, pick some simple app. It's just, there's just so much that type of software is required to do. And so it's just really cool to see what a bunch of really experienced folks, you know, with the resources and the time have come up with and are coming up with. And it's so funny. I'll briefly share one more anecdote since we're talking about this. My wife's harpist, still plays harp. And I was talking to Daniel, and then she was walking by and she said, I mentioned somehow that it does harp pedaling, and she was very skeptical because she's used to that being a disaster. And she got in and was looking at some combos, and she said, oh yeah, that's true. Like, it turns red if you can't do those notes with that pedal combination. And just having those sort of, nerfing the instrument or idiot-proofing the instrument or just giving you some of those parameters. Well, you can't rely on the software to tell you everything. I think that's the sort of thing that allows people to maybe arrange for an instrument that they might not. Like a student of mine wanted to do the Shostakovich Waltz No. 2, which we have an arrangement from you for basses for that. She wanted to do it with bass and guitar. And so I just, grabbed a part off Muse score for piano and flute or something like that and moved over to guitar. And then I thought, well, this guitarist is an amateur. Let's put some tabs in there. And, the auto tab, while I could probably figure out better voicings or different spots, it's just the ease of use of that. I mean, that's the sort of thing I would probably have never agreed to before Dorico, because I would have had to go research how to do it all on Finale. And, we did the lesson. 15 minutes later, she's got her arrangement.
Wow. I want to put a plug in for what you're talking about here. MuseScore is a fine engraving program and everything, but what's really valuable about MuseScore is that website that is just chock full of arrangements that people have done of stuff and digitization of sheet music. That it's always a starting point for me, just purely to get the notes into the program, to go out and find what's on MuseScore and work with that rather than try to sit there and go A, B, D, F. The amount of time I'm saving on doing these things by being able to go grab something and massage it from where it is into that point. You used to have to go surfing the web for midis of things, and invariably with a MIDI, every note starts a 30-second note before the bar, and there's all these crazy ties and quadruple dotting and all this unusable junk in there that you spend more time fixing than you would have just entering quarter notes in, manually. And so what you're talking about there, I'm very inspired, because it's how I work every time, is just try to find somebody that's already done some of the work for you.
Oh, I'm so glad you do that. I feel like such a dirty cheater when I do that. But in reality, like I wish I had that 20 years ago, that resource. And so another one of my students is really into sports, like really into sports. So this has been a rough year for him, though things have come back. And so NFL season, we found this trumpet trio of every NFL theme from every network, Thursday night football from, all the, and this is not my world at all. So I'm so glad I was able to find that. I never, ever, ever would have done this on my own. But I started with that trumpet trio. And how do you get a trumpet trio into a bass duo? Well, you massage it a little bit. It's really easy in Dorico. Add a couple bass lines, pull the trumpet into the bass clef, get it out of 5 flats. That's all easy. Drop it in an octave. Oh, and we have now a substantially different arrangement. Extend some things, but just using that as a starting place is great. And yeah, just those little things that just get the creative process going. It's incredible. I love that you use that. That is anybody that listening, that's money well spent, is a year-long MuseScore subscription. And the fact that the software is free, that there's an actual music notation software, that I rewind 5 years ago to when I was teaching high school, I had several students who were getting into arranging, and MuseScore is what they were using. And how cool that there is an Audacity-like product for music notation. Prior to MuseScore, I didn't know what to recommend to people. It's like, well, I guess buy Finale, or you could use Noteflight or other things online that are a little more limited, but it's cool. I'll use Dorico any day over MuseScore, just in terms of the way it works for me, but it's great to see something like that out there that's free.
Yeah, and I'd like to point everybody out, if anybody's actually interested in engraving and interested in how these things work, there's a YouTuber named Pantacruel who has done some really great reviews of the different merits of the different engraving softwares, and he actually works for MuseScore now, and he's helping them to increase the intuitive qualities of their user interface. And I think that that's super cool. I'm starting to appreciate open source software now in a way that I hadn't before. I'm working with this thing called Davinci Resolve for video stuff, which is another free or freemium where you can pay to upgrade to the full featured thing. But and MuseScore, and I think there's a lot of merit to that out in the world, and it's there's such a stark contrast, because the buy-in for Sibelius Finale I think is still to the tune of $700 or something like that. It's really like you have to make a professional investment at that point. It's like buying a concert design stool or something like that. Like, it's going to be great. You're going to love it. You're going to have it forever. But that's a really big commitment. And, it's certainly difficult to ask that of people during the pandemic. But, even just generally, musicians, I doubt that I've made $700 ever on my, engraving my Sibelius use. Although, if you count all the lessons that it's enhanced and all that sort of stuff, you could make a case, I guess. But it took a long, long time to make back that investment. And having a free option that's deep and capable, I think, is huge. But their cloud storage and that website are really where the money's at, or not the money, but the value, because it's just such an incredible resource. And these days, if I want to play a Radiohead song and I want to get access to the notes, I don't want to figure out a line. There's a lot of that stuff too. There's a lot of everything there.
And it's a great resource for people that want to get want to get into this world of composing and arranging, because has some social network features to it, right? And so you can provide feedback, you can give people star rating, they encourage you when you download something. So it's a cool way to say, here, I made this, in this niche that we're talking about. YouTube is an example of that for video. Certainly, their example, for writing and that sort of thing. But for composing and arranging, and actually how are you laying things out. It's just really cool that that is out there in the world. It's almost like two separate products with the same name. Is this compendium of music that we're talking about, and then the software. And it's so great to see access to something that really can be used without limits. And once you start doing, like, if you're writing for Netflix or working with Netflix, okay, $500, $700, that's a worthwhile investment. Just like you're subbing with Philadelphia, spending a few $1,000s on a bow is but when you're starting out, maybe a $200 carbon fiber bow, just something to get you in the door. So MuseScore might be kind of in that category. And I love that Davinci Resolve is out there in the world now too, because unless you're on a Mac, and iMovie's kind of you could do a lot, but you run into the limits pretty quick. Having something that has depth like Davinci Resolve is really great to see out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I wanted to speak to something that you mentioned, which is, when you were talking about arranging these NFL tracks and starting from a trumpet trio and basically just doing the little work of getting it formatted so that it looks like it's 4-bass and maybe putting it in a nicer key and everything. That, I think, is a really good way to start arranging. And you need to appreciate, I think, that a lot of arranging in the world happens just that way, and that it is, on some level, that simple. You're going to, as you do that, you're going to see, oh, man, that's really going high for bass 1. I need to drop this down an octave here or find a place to adjust these things. And it's like, it was, composers used to have to do their own arrangements of their own pieces, and they were a lot closer to the original thing than you think. It's like Matisse doing a series of the same painting and having small variations on it. Arvo Pärt would do his Fratres, and it would be originally for orchestra with percussion, and then he would do it for cello and piano, and then he would do it for violin and piano, and the cello and violin versions are very similar, and that's not like he was a crappy arranger or he was doing something without really putting his integrity behind it. I think getting something in the shape that you can play it on your instrument is, that's arranging, and that's a really good intro to that practice. We all do it as bass players with Bach suites too. And, everybody that's ever read a cello part of a Bach suite and then played it on the bass gets to say they transcribed it. That's legitimate and that's valid. And I think, when we're talking about like the merits of Dorico and Sibelius and all this deep stuff, it's important to keep in mind that the top layer of this is just getting stuff played on different instruments and putting it into the hands of more people. And I think that's what MuseScore, it's democratizing this whole thing so that everybody can do that. The barrier to entry is really low, and you can get started on it like I did with Cakewalk back in the day, and it can lead somewhere that's really exciting without it necessarily having to be Ravel orchestrating pictures at an exhibition where it's like completely reinventing the game. You could just be participating in this ages-old tradition of keeping some music alive by being able to play it in different spaces or, with different timbres.
Yeah, for sure. And there's something about the way that I came up in the music world that I imagine you as well, just spending so much time in front of the printed page. You just sort of think of this thing as being etched into stone, and you start to do more arranging or play around, or like what I'm doing with my students with that NFL suite. You start to realize the fluidity of music. Like you're saying, put it up an octave, drop it an octave. It's been fun talking through that educationally with the couple students that I have, and oh yeah, we can do whatever we want here. Let's do this, let's do that. And I've actually been at, where do you think this should go? Does this make sense? Let's play it. Does that sound good? What do you think? Should we make those dots? Should we make those lines? Should we start up bow, down bow? All that. It's been fun. And then at the end of the lesson, go over to the export, send it to them. Here, we made this together, or you made this, or here are your ideas. I think that were I doing more teaching, or if I rewound to being a classroom teacher, I could see myself doing a lot more of that in my teaching, because anything to get away from the sage on the stage, spouting the information to the receptacles that are the students. It's cool. It's cool that this chapter. I mean, starting as a composition major, you've had a background in this, but it's really cool to see you pivot. That's incredible.
I hope I hope that if it's anything, it could be like helpful to somebody that's trying to figure out how to make the best out of this situation, and figuring out how to continue to be artistically satisfied. For me, ultimately, I think this was coming one way or another, because over the last couple of years, I'd really dialed up my performing and dialed back my teaching and my administrative stuff and everything else, and really centered my life around performing. And I want to be really clear here. I've had some of the best opportunities that a freelancer could have, and I'm so lucky for that. And nothing that I'm about to say is to diminish what I'm trying to say, but spending 18,000 miles a year in your car and countless hours, away from your family and just on the road listening to great podcasts and music and stuff, it has a kind of satisfaction to it that is meaningful, and it's not nothing. But I think when you are a freelancer and you have this opportunity to mix in different things in your life, getting stuck on like what other people think your career should look like can lead to a lot of unhappiness. And what I found was, I just need something else, even if it was subbing with the Philadelphia Orchestra every week. I think there's a lot of merit to having something else in your life that isn't orchestral music, because the fundamental truth about orchestral music is it's curatorship. It's maintaining a tradition. It's preserving something that is on the page, and that is sort of intangible, and it's your job to recreate it both as accurately as possible and as personally as possible. But it's not creating. It's not. And I needed to be creating something. I had to do it. And these arrangements that I had done were a part of that. It was really, I got into composing because I was arranging for two basses, and I was finding limits, a lot of them. Particularly in how interesting is it to listen to two basses play together for an hour with no alleviating circumstances,
Right.
And I just needed to have something in there that was mine and that I had actually done. And the fact that I ended up like with Netflix as like one of my first gigs out of the gate doing this is great. And I don't think it's just happenstance, I would have been perfectly happy writing my pop tunes that were 2.5 minutes long, because it was still the same. It was scratching the same itch. And arguably, once you have like financial commitments behind the stuff that you're being told to write, it changes things a little bit too. When you monetize a hobby, it doesn't stay a hobby for very long, and professions can be stressful and lead to other problems in your life. But I just needed to do something, and I'm in a lot of ways, I've tried to make the best out of this pandemic by creating the whole time, instead of feeling the loss of my performing and my curatorship hat, because that is devastating, and I think it's devastating for everybody that plays the bass. It's not the same to play in your house as it is to play on a stage, but you can still do stuff, and people should be doing stuff, and it's all at your fingertips,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I've the less orchestral music I play, the more I enjoy playing orchestral music, if that makes sense. The least I enjoyed was when I was doing tens of thousands of miles and playing with a lot of groups, that some great groups, but some groups that where it was like, okay, do I really want to play another like okay Brahms 2? I think I'd rather every week, or how about I play an amazing Brahms 2 every couple of months and really enjoy the process. That's just me and where things fell out for me, but and everybody's different, but yeah, if ever there were a time to show how it's probably good to have more than one iron in the fire, I think people realize, have learned that lesson.
I read with great interest your book like 10 years ago, Road Warrior Without an Expense Account. And I was an avid follower of your blog in its infancy days. And I just remember thinking, because you were expressing a lot of the dystopian sort of feelings back then that I was getting to like a year and a half ago, and thinking like, Jason Heath, what the hell does he know about this stuff? Like, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it right. And then sure enough, it's like that story you tell about having to drive through the night to get down to Iris after like a gig, and just like I remember packing up after a gig that ended, like I did an outdoor gig in Philly that was like went more than 2 hours overtime. And then I needed to get to Saratoga Springs the next morning to play with the Philly Orchestra. So I went into the gig with that plan. I had the car all packed up and everything, and I was going to drive through the night, hit Saratoga at like 2 a.m., sleep in my car, I guess, and then do the rehearsal the next morning at 10. And they called off that. They turned out they didn't need me to sub that day, and I didn't find out until I was walking off stage, and I was all keyed up about having to get in the car and drive. And it was the biggest relief of my life. And I missed out on some money. I missed out on a playing opportunity, but it was like, wow, I didn't want to do that. I was going to do that, but I didn't want to do that. And ultimately, it's important to listen to yourself and try to read between the lines of what your brain's trying to tell you when you have those kind of feelings. Sometimes it's not all about the glory and being the guy with all the gigs and that kind of zero-sum game of I have to get gigs and that means other people have to lose them kind of thing. What you're talking about, saving yourself for the high-level stuff and being excited about it and being there and present, as opposed to kind of sleepwalking your way through a series of gigs just because they fit on paper. That's got to be the way of the future.
Yeah, it's and I think there are seasons in life, and there's probably a time when the correct answer is yes to most things. And I got to say, there's part of me that thrives on the chaos of the no sleep and the drinking a venti coffee at 1 a.m, as the temperature hovers around freezing. And I had some of the it's amazing what we get used to as humans. I mean, it's amazing to me that I'm used to putting a mask on and walking outside. If you told Jason from a year ago that would be normal, I would have not believed you. But I remember back to, and it's funny, I feel like a totally different person from the guy that wrote that book in the mid 2000s. I'm glad I did it, but it's fun, and I'm glad I aired whatever my exercise my demons or whatever. But I remember driving all night, and I did it, and then I thought, well, that was horrible, and then I got used to doing it, and I started doing it even for a few gigs that didn't make any sense. I drove back from Memphis to play principal bass for this community orchestra that I think I got $100 for the gig, maybe, or 120. And I remember talking to somebody in the bass section, and I said, "Oh yeah, I just drove from Memphis." And they're like, "What are you to play this gig? What's wrong?" And then I thought, "No, but that's what you do. That's what I do." And then I think that might have been the last time I drove through the night.
Yeah. It's virtue signaling in some way. You have to show to the people, if you're not winning a job, you need to show to the people who are encouraging you and want you to do that you're committed, your heart's in it. And ironically, some of those decisions that we make about freelancing actually detract from that bigger picture goal of actually maybe winning the job, because wouldn't it have been more valuable to have be well rested, be at home most of the time, and be practicing, as opposed to overextending yourself on these gigs and then getting to that point where you're making the decision between taking that opera gig or taking that opera audition and thinking, well, the short money is on the gig, and so I should just do that. We get into these things, and we're really doing it for other people. I think I was doing it to live up to my idols. I have Hal Robinson lives 2 miles away, and I'm really lucky to get to talk to him and bounce things off of him a lot. And a lot of my ego is invested in making sure Hal thinks I'm doing the right thing. Actually, this is really embarrassing, but I'm going to say it anyway. I had this audition notebook or this audition binder that I used for probably the first 10 or 15 auditions. And I had Hal Robinson used to have these glossy photos that one of them was a Parastro ad of just him with a mustache, which I don't even know if Hal ever existed in the real world with a mustache, but the picture was there. So I had this picture, and my an ex-girlfriend had put a speech bubble on it that said, "You're doing the right thing, Brent." And that was the front of my audition binder. So every time I'd go, I'd open it up, see Hal. All right, let's do this. Let's play some Koos, And so, a lot of what we do is feeding into this expectation monster of you have your undergraduate teacher, your master's teacher, all those private people who just put the time in to get you on the road and get you on the right path. And you play for a bunch of people in the section maybe, and you're the weight of their expectations, which don't actually exist, but you make them manifest and you live with them and you deal with them all the time. And, I think they probably would like to see you having a nicer, more middle-class, normal lifestyle than being a crazy, like midnight driver person. And, it takes a while to get to that place where you accept that about yourself and learn to make the most of it and live in the life that you have.
Yeah, that's a very well articulated description of something that I've felt, and I think that so many people have felt through their whole lives. And I felt that, and of course there was no expectation that I would do anything. People just want the best for you. They're probably not thinking about you as nearly as much as you think they are. And if they are thinking about you, they're thinking, oh yeah, Brent's awesome, Jason's awesome, you're awesome. You're gonna do great. Yeah, and not I wonder if he advanced. I wonder if and you ruined their day because you didn't advance. But we have those irrational things in our mind, and me, everybody's got their own path, but me, that book was kind of an attempt to set fire to my career and start something new. It's stuff I never would have written about back when I was actively taking auditions, because I wanted everybody to like me. I didn't want to rock the boat at all. And the irony is that by kind of hanging out my shingle in a sense and doing that and starting the podcast and doing all these things without permission, I had no intent for this, but I ended up becoming more interesting to people. And I ended up, the sequel to the book that is not published is I ended up with way better gigs. After writing all that. I ended up doing things that Jason could never have imagined doing and would have loved doing. And that was never my intent, but I just, by kind of quitting the worrying so much about what other people thought of me or what I should be doing. I'm glad I did what I did, I guess.
I think of it in terms of transcendence. Like you left the surly bonds of freelancing and you became, this like bodhisattva kind of character where you had achieved a type of enlightenment, but you were deliberately sticking around to help out everybody else to get a little closer to that point. And, it's always been very inspiring to me. And, I'm not meaning to turn this into like a love fest or anything like that, but, in some way that was like a pebble towards the ultimate avalanche that, I feel myself doing the same thing. And as grateful as I am for people calling me for the college, ringer gigs and the community orchestra gigs and all that sort of stuff. And it took years to build up the credibility around town that I was even getting those calls, but now that I am where I am, it's like, what can I take of this and make it into what pieces of this actually belong in my life and what pieces of this came with those pieces. And I've just been assuming they were all inextricably linked. How do I, parse? I definitely want to do like the big orchestra kind of stuff when I can. I've got a couple, regional groups that I'm a part of, and I want to deepen my ties with them instead of treating every one of those weeks like an unfortunate obligation that I have to clear out my schedule to make work. I just want to do the things that I want to do. Yes, there's seasons. Like, the start of the freelance rise is just work when you can and be happy for it and be a nice guy and just try to be like a diplomat to everybody so that you can get the other gigs, But at a certain point you get to that, the limit of that, and you either, I guess, win a job, which is a rarity, I think, for the long-term freelancers anyway, or you figure out how to fit that into your life in a way that's more healthy and more sane. And I'm there, and I've been there. I've been there about a year and a half, and I'm really like building these other revenue streams as an arranger, as a composer, as a freelance video editor for people and stuff. It's been tiding me over, but I also could see it being something that adds to the overall fulfillment of my life. And it's not looking at it like a loss or a failure. It's really, this is what the meat of it always was, to be a musician or be a creator all the time and discard the parts of it that don't serve that purpose. Because even if you need a couple $100 here and there to get to where you need to be financially, if it's at the cost of your mental health, that's not worth it, I guess.
Yeah, it's so hard to zoom out, anybody anywhere, but in my personal experience as a musician, I think back to like almost 20 years ago at this point. Holy cow! I was principal bass of this community orchestra that I was talking about driving through the night to get to, and I was miserable at the gig. It was like my least favorite day of the week. Monday, I taught all day, and then I went to this community orchestra, and everyone was complaining at each other. It was one of those like weirdly complainy community orchestras. Everyone has a different vibe. Some of them are fun. This one, I don't know what it was. I could probably think deeply about it and come up with a reason, but it was one of those things. I didn't want to give it up because I made $2,200 a year doing that community orchestra. Where would I get the $2,200? But I finally quit. I'm like, I cannot do this. And it was like a weight came off my shoulders, and I looked at my finances the next year and I made like $8,000 more, and every time I have let something go, let it go and disappear into the ocean, from my ballet gig, I look and I can see in the balance sheet that I actually make more. And so though I think that that fixed mentality is such a thing that we struggle with, and especially anybody who's on the auditions trail or has been, and you're competing for literally limited spots. There is scarcity. Here is this paper. Here are the jobs. But that's not the music world, really. That's not the world, really. And here you are creating music in your place, right? Writing in Dorico, turning to your right, recording it. You are creating music. And what you're doing that's like the classic artist life. If you look throughout history, you're doing, I'm not trying to compare you to Mozart, but let's compare you to Mozart or Beethoven or whatever. Look at what they actually did. They did a lot closer to what you're doing right now than to somebody who's a full-time section instrumentalist in a major orchestra.
Yeah, if you set aside the whole, bubble, we could call it, of like the rise of the full-time orchestral musician as a career path, like, yeah, Beethoven and Mozart were hustlers. Those guys really had to scrap and fight for money, and they were teaching nobles' kids like piano lessons and putting together their own concerts of their music. It wasn't like there was an orchestra with a full-time slate of programs and you just try to get your thing on that Friday's concert. They would organize the whole thing, and Beethoven would premiere, 3 symphonies at a time or something. Like, imagine going to a concert and getting bombarded with those as new pieces of music, brand new experiences, like, and that's a lot of composers and stuff these days do something along those lines. A lot of, I think just musicians generally have a lot of different revenue streams. One of the things I'm really grateful for with this Netflix project is you have cue sheets and their residual payments that are involved in these sorts of things. I don't know what that money's going to be. I'd be happy if it was like a nice dinner once a year or something. Mm-hmm. But, people like composers can build up an aggregate of little residual payments over their lifetime that end up taking care of them in retirement, that sort of thing. And they're also, publishing their music on the side. It's not a straight path. And the orchestral lifestyle gives us this illusion that, if you're just good enough and you just work hard enough, you're going to get this one thing and you'll never have to worry about anything. You'll never be less than where you are at that point. You just got to make it over this one hurdle. And that's the the carrot that's dangled in front of you that gets everybody to run and work hard. And arguably it's been so good for the technical ability of bass players in the world that they have that enticement. But, are we all doing what artists used to do? Like, are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater of this hustling thing? Sounds undignified and difficult, but is it adding something to the world generally that is good? And will it count more for me to have had something on a TV show than to have played that Messiah that one time in that church that didn't go so well? And the trumpet shell sound solo was really terrible. I mean, it's like, who's going to remember that stuff versus who's going to have a tangible thing? Like, if I ever get to make a CD, if those still exist by the time I'm ready, like, that'll be something you can hold in your hand and say, I did this. I have gigabytes. I have like a hard drive now of music that I've written in the last 6 months that's something I did. And I think, like, we owe it to ourselves to create, just to have those tangibles that we can take away from it,
Yeah, I know. Creating something that's an asset, that's something that's out there in the world. I mean, it's any way that you could find to do that. It's beautiful. Whether it's if we rewind several decades when there was more orchestral recording work, or that was more of a thing. I remember talking to my former teacher, Michael Hovnani, in the Chicago Symphony. He got there in the late '80s, like at the heyday of those Schulte recordings. You know, we're in a different era right now than that, and things just change and move. But you look around, you know, this might be a weird thing to think about, but everything that we do, those of us, you and I, who came up like in an orchestrally trained world, everything we're doing is the product of hustlers. We're playing music written by hustlers. We're in some building. Someone had the audacity to build this building. We're playing in this orchestra or playing a gig. Someone had the audacity to go out and do that. So those who, and I've thought about that over the years so often. More specific example, there's a couple, Jim and Jean Birkenstock. They were principal flute and principal bassoon of the Lyric Opera of Chicago. They also started several performing organizations with budgets in the millions, you know, and I played so many Jean and Jim gigs. I played it for 15 years in the Chamber Music Festival. They just thought of it and they did that, right? That was they brought that into the world. I played this orchestra called the Chicago Philharmonic. Larry Radcliffe from Rice University was the conductor for years and years. That was an idea of Jim's. You know, Jim was a music history PhD, and he just wanted to find a way to, that Chamber Music Festival, it was a way for him to nerd out and research music. And so he's not composing, but there was another example of someone who created something that brought so much to musicians. So it's a hard thing to think about when you're driving to that gig, driving all night to that gig, or you're playing your third Messiah, but really the abundance mindset is such a beautiful thing if you can tap into it. And when Brent, I could have you on every day of the week. It's so fun. We've got to do this more often. But one last my overcaffeinated brain thought is oh, I lost it. Uh-oh, never mind. I'm thinking about the caffeine. Anyway, that's okay. Hey man, there's one thing. So we got this sheet music store. So yeah. And we're thinking of different ways to market this, and so you know we've built up this email list, and we're going to try on every Tuesday to talk about a different piece. And so I'm trying to build some videos of me like either playing the piece if there's not a video, reacting to the video, talking to the composer or arranger. So would you be down just for like talking a little bit about each of the 4 arrangements that we've got, and also anything in the future? Obviously you're busy writing for Netflix at the moment, but anything you've got that you want to throw in there? The sales have been pretty good so far, actually, and we've barely done any. We put out like a video about it, and that's it. But I think it's really cool, and all credit to Trevor for coming up with the idea. He's the you know, they created the infrastructure for it. But yeah, would you be down for just saying a few words? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool, man.
I want to preface this by saying that the arrangements that you guys are selling in the store right now came out of a project that I did back in I believe it was 2015 with my dear friend Amanda Rice Johnston. And I bring Amanda up about a year ago. Amanda had a brain aneurysm rupture, and Amanda's been on the road to recovery since November of last year, and things are going well, slow but well. And I can't talk about any of this stuff without talking about Amanda, because she was the impetus behind all these arrangements, and they all came about as a result. We had decided, talking about pluck and just kind of doing something to do it. We created a bass duet tour. The group was called Bear J, which was B.E., Brent Edmondson, and Amanda Rice Johnson, ARJ. And we were sponsored at the time by Nick Lloyd, and Nick Lloyd gave us 2 basses to perform on, and we did a college tour, went down as far as Virginia, went up as far as Boston, and all points in between. And it was just this incredible week of, it was like the quintessential van tour kind of thing, except it was in a RAV4. And so these were performance arrangements that I had conceived of, and I had the brilliant idea that at the time we didn't know how we were monetizing this tour. So I printed up these arrangements after I had finished them with some nice covers and everything, and we're sort of selling them, one by one to students who came to see these recitals that we did. And to have these arrangements have a new life in the now times, and to get them online and get them out to a wider audience is really great because one of the things I think that your store does really well, and one of the things that's a challenge for people who are sort of in the insular bass world is it's easy for me to reach somebody who's at a conservatory if I talk to their teacher and stuff, and that's talking to a very narrow and deep channel of the bass world that is the really, really serious, dedicated students that ended up at these 6 or 7 schools that I have contacts with. And what I really appreciate is that this project that was, so much the product of the love between Amanda and I is that it's getting out to the wide world, and that these arrangements are going to be played and seen by people who would, don't necessarily come from that background. And I think one of my, to talk about one of these arrangements in specific, there's the Philip Glass Metamorphosis #1. Now that came about because I'm a huge Battlestar Galactica fan, and there's a really, really poignant scene in the show where that is the backdrop of a character really, reminiscing about a life that she's left behind and everything. And the music blew me away when I first heard it, and I just I had to come to terms with that music. And so this arrangement, which is kind of simplistic. It's more what we were talking about earlier about just really adapting the piano part to 2 basses. It was very simple in the process, but what kind of happens, it goes from being this bass duet to being this kind of hypnotic trance kind of piece, and it could just go on forever. And we found actually when we performed it that the more repeats that we took and the longer we made it, the more positive the response to it. Like people really, it's those alpha brain waves that everybody's trying to get to all the time. You can really put somebody in a nice hypnotic state like that. And I wish there was more music out there that did that thing, because I think that that's special, and it's an underappreciated, corner of the art form is this. I'm a huge fan of Eric Satie, and that concept of furniture music. It's just music that's in the room with you. It's not meant to be listened to directly. It's meant to be just experienced as part of what you're doing. So the Glass Metamorphosis is that it's not particularly hard to play. I did a little bit of work making sure we passed off parts back and forth so that there was a lot of equality there. But really, it's just about creating this space for people to think about other stuff and to just be inside their body and hearing something that sounds really cool. So I love that one, and that's, it's short, it's very simple, it's accessible to, I think, younger players and stuff. You just, it's a great little piece. And I put on the cover of that, the mandala that comes from Battlestar Galactica, that is that, that moment of, all this has happened before and all of this will happen again, which is kind of what that piece I think is about too. The other piece that I'm so fond of, you mentioned it earlier, was the Shostakovich Waltz #2 from his jazz suite, or Suite for Variety Orchestra, rather. Obviously that's got a lot of commercial credibility. It was, it's been in commercials literally, but it's also been in movies like Eyes Wide Shut is one that prominently uses it, although your younger viewers don't go looking that one up necessarily. But I love Shostakovich. I love the macabre quality to it. I love the way that it's very, it's very haunting, and yet it's also beautiful. Like you kind of move between unsettling and beautiful very, very fluidly. And my biggest pride moment in that piece, it comes when there's a recapitulation of the original theme down an octave. And in the original orchestration of the piece, that's a trombone solo accompanied by piccolo, which, how very Shostakovich of him to do that. And so what I did was by bringing the melody down an octave, I freed up some sonic space. And the second bass, I still feel a little bit dubious about this when I go to play it because it's really hard. But I conceived of this Bottesini type accompaniment to that would be something along the lines of one of the really arpeggiated movements of one of the variations that he had done, or the Grand Duo has one of these great moments of, the second bass player is literally covering from the low D to the highest notes of the bass over and over and over again. You're just cycling through it. It's like a great technique etude, but it's also just a really fun way to watch the first bass player go into the comfort zone and be able to play and like really lay into the lyrical line, but then watch the second bass player just like collapse in a heap of steam at the same time. Like, I think it's a really good juxtaposition, and it's really, it's capturing that theatrical element of the music itself, where, there's a spectacle happening. There's somebody doing something really absurd on their instrument right now. And besides the fact that the music's cool, this is something that's fun to watch. So make sure you video yourself if you're gonna use that one. And
I
then,
will.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to the deep dive into that part of that.
Yeah, that one's going to be a challenge. I think I'll start with the I'll start with the Philip Glass one. Dip my toes in first, but a challenge accepted.
And I think on that more poignant note, there's the Piazzolla pieces. There's an Angel Suite that's 2 movements. Piazzolla had done 3 angel named pieces. I believe I could be talking out of school here, but I think his mother might have been named Angela, Angelina, something along those lines. So I think that there's a personal aspect to these pieces, but regardless of the biographical details, there's a very personal affect to these pieces. And I had originally conceived the Piazzolla Angel Suite and the Melotongo to be all in one, perform these as three pieces with no real pause between them, kind of thing. But the Angel Suite itself, I think the Milonga del Angel is just this slow burn, sensuous kind of piece. It really feels, you're instantly in that zone where you're like in a smoky bar playing tango and people are dancing, and it's like, it's a bit PG-13, and you can just kind of feel there's a heavy atmosphere in the room, kind of thing. I'm really proud of that one. I had handed that off to Hal Robinson, and he had done a recording of it with Nate West, which unfortunately the Piazzolla Foundation found out about and put the kibosh on. But there have been some tinkering phases with that piece, just to experiment with the accompaniment being more pizzicato and more sort of authentic to the tango style, or just really playing around with the rhythms and being more flexible with it. And it's hard to make that piece work if you really get deep into the details and you really want to emphasize the tango aspect of it. But the immediacy of the piece is really strong. It grips people. It's always been a crowd pleaser. It's not super hard to play, which I think helps a lot, but there's a lot of impact from every little moment that happens in it. And it's hard to look back on that creative process and figure out how I even did that. It feels like it's bigger than me in a lot of ways. And I'm really proud of it. And I just remember that experience of playing that on tour with Amanda, getting to do that like day after day, and play to the crowds a little bit, especially, doing a college tour and playing, quite honestly, for a lot of testosterone juiced male, young, college aged males. It's just, I think it plays well with the bass crowd generally, but I think it also transcends that, and it gives it something that, other audiences would really enjoy. And just to prove that it's not all about, like the hormone monster and everything, that was like the central thing that I was building a sort of retirement home tour around that was supposed to be happening this past spring, was this Angel Suite. And I think it really just it hits everybody differently depending on their life experiences. But that's one of the beautiful things about tango and Piazzolla's music generally, is just that universality that comes from all the specifics of it. It's really, it's a beautiful piece. And the Melotongo is one of my favorites, just to round this out, because I discovered with this one, I was able to appropriate a tool that I often use in David Anderson's 7 duets. In Parade of the Politically Prudent Pigs, that top line that happens, both basses end up getting it. When you hold those notes out, back when I was first learning those pieces, I had poor bow control. So every once in a while, I'd be trying to play really loud, and I would go ponicello during that note. And I kind of realized that it sounded like a guitar feeding back. And Dave's description of that movement is that it's Jimi Hendrix meets Rush Limbaugh. And I'm really looking forward to a time in American culture where people don't know who Rush Limbaugh is. But, getting that Jimi Hendrix guitar feedback, that just sort of wild, out of control thing, that a Melotongo really, to me, is the perfect showcase for that. There are a lot of long notes that you can kind of get wild with the vibrato, wild with the bow contact point, and really transform out of bass duet and into sort of, it's almost a rock and roll kind of vibe. And you could imagine Piazzolla with his like quintet touring around, some nights were probably rowdier than others, and just kind of like deciding to turn the bass up a little bit more, turn the guitar up, drive the amp a little bit more. And that's sort of the goal behind that piece. And I think it's a really fun journey to go from the milonga to that piece and really come out of it, sort of having covered like 40 years of music history and arrive on the other end scathed but still alive, hopefully. That's the target emotion there. Yeah.
That's awesome, man. I was going through the arrangements and just checking them out, and I'm pumped to dig into them. I've got ideas for filming them. I'll try to like maybe key myself out of one side so it's both of me playing at the same time. We'll see if I can get some sort of. So I'll play around for sure. Man, thank you for being on board with these pieces. I think that this will be really fun, and we got to chat more often for the podcast. I don't know if we have since whenever, like 2015, 2016 or something like that. Yeah. In the meantime, we have both joined and quit the ISB board. Done so many other things. Brent, you rock. I had such a great time chatting with you. BrentEdmondson.com is his website. Check him out. Check out what he does. Check out that episode from almost 5 years ago at this point. We talked in early 2016, February of 2016, I believe, as I checked back on the date. And it's so cool to think about where life has taken him, where life has taken me. He was somebody that I think sort of saw the potential of relaunching this podcast, Contrabass Conversations, probably earlier than I did, frankly. And I remember talking with him about some topics, and it was some other people around that time that sort of saw what I might end up doing as a result of this podcast. And that's come to pass, which is crazy. I guess this is what I do. This isn't really what I do, though. I do things because of this show now at this point, but I've liked to think of this show as just being what I would be talking about with these people anyway. I have no format, if you haven't realized. I don't send any questions ahead of time. Certainly, if someone asks, and sometimes people do ask because they know this show is relatively popular, about what we might talk about, I'll send some vague topics that I think could be cool. But like, I wouldn't send some script to somebody if we're going to go have coffee or a beer. And so I don't think of that with this show either. There are many, many ways to do this podcast thing, though. And as I see more and more music podcasters, other podcasters launch their thing, I watch with interest as people explore this medium in various ways. And I draw inspiration from a lot of what I'm seeing. And I just find it really interesting to see how people are exploring the medium, which I think is quite a flexible medium. If you were to ask me, should I launch a podcast? I would say, and I'm repeating myself for sure, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, I would say if you think of it as a self-improvement project, yes, it's so great. Absolutely. If you're thinking of it as something that's going to make money, I would say probably spend your time doing something else, because podcasting for most is a long, slow burn. Growing a podcast is fairly vague. Metrics for podcasting are fairly vague. It's there's financial investment in podcasting that there's just not in starting a YouTube channel. I think that probably focusing on YouTube and Instagram, depending on what resonates with you most, would probably be my recommendation if someone is going to boot something up. Or maybe TikTok. I'm 44 years old and I just haven't logged into TikTok recently. I do have it on my phone, but I haven't. Anyway, I'm talking about TikTok at the end of 2020, apparently. Thank you for listening. I'll shut up now. I really appreciate it. If you are at the end of this episode, you're either on a run and you can't get to your phone, or you're a true fan. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening and for being on this journey with me, with Brent, this punk rock thing that I started in 2007 that has united the bass community in a weird way that I guess I hoped it would if I listened back to episode 1 of this podcast. Not that I do that frequently, but it has ended up being what I kind of hoped it would be back in late 2006 as I was planning it, early 2007 as I was launching it. And yeah, the only reason it exists is because folks enjoy it and it brings me some value. And so while I would probably have conversations like this with Brent anyway, even if there wasn't a podcast, the podcast is an excuse for us to do that. And so that's what you've been listening to. If this is your first episode or 780th or anywhere in between, just thank you. Feedback at contrabassconversations.com if you want to reach out to me. We are wherever you are on social media. If you're listening to this in the future, we're on whatever new platform is on, so I'm not going to necessarily, I'm sure Facebook will be around, I'm sure Instagram will be around, but I do love, again, not that I go back and listen to my old episodes, but I do love me hawking my MySpace page and my TalkBass forum, which has been long deleted by them, and all that sort of stuff. So thank you to the team that puts these episodes together: Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, Trevor Jones, and Krista Copper. Krista has a super cool podcast, The Backstage Creative. She did an episode celebrating 2 years and reflecting on 2 years of podcasting that I found to be quite insightful and struck a chord with me. So check that out, thebackstagecreative.com, or just search for her. It'll come up. Mitch makes beautiful basses in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I still haven't had Mitch on the podcast, which is crazy. I think he appeared in just a couple clips on my luthier rant from several years ago. But Mitch, we got to get you on the show, man. It'll happen. I'm your host, Jason Heath. Thank you. Here's to a better year for 2021, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.